Sorry, we had a little glitch there in the video. Most of the research, though, has shown that if the jury is actually able to reach a verdict, there's not much difference in whether they're likely to reach a guilty or not guilty verdict when there is a larger, say a 12-person jury, or a somewhat smaller, say a 6-person jury. However, there is a strong effect on whether the jury reaches any verdict whatsoever. And the pattern is that larger juries are more likely to fail to reach a verdict, that is, and they're more likely to take longer to reach their decision than smaller juries. Now, this is true particularly when cases are fairly close ones, that is, where there are quite a few people who think the defendant is not guilty and quite a few people who think the defendant is guilty. Now, that result falls out of, that is, it's a consequence of the social decision scheme models that we've been talking about earlier. So Jim Davis and some others, including me in 1975, tried to say what would happen if a 2/3 majority always won, but if you didn't have an initial 2/3 majority, the jury would hang all the time. And we basically said, well, it depends a bit about where the jury starts. So it depends on the probability of an initial guilty vote by the jury. And in this graph, we're contrasting a 6-person and a 12-person jury under that 2/3 majority wins, hung otherwise. And between 6 and 12-person juries, there's not much difference in the probability of conviction. That's this first graph, or the probability of acquittal. That's the second graph, although there are small differences. Where you find a big difference is here on the probability of a hung jury. And if the the probability of guilty is moderate, in here between, say, a third and 2/3, then you find a big difference, and the difference is such that the 12-person juries are much more likely to hang than the smaller juries. Now, that's just a theoretical prediction, but that means that you have to then go out and see if that's actually the case. And so, is it the case that simply by the way that you sample and put together initial verdicts, you find this difference in hung jury rates? So in 1983, I and Robert McCoon did a study where we contrasted juries of different sizes, 3-person, 6-person, and 12-person juries, and we took care to use cases that were very close. They had been selected ahead of time to be ones where there was a lot of good evidence for both sides. And the important point is illustrated here in the final column, where we have the proportion of times that the jury hung, couldn't reach a decision at all. And only about 9% of these 3-person juries hung, but if you took 6-person juries, considering exactly the same cases, they hung about a quarter of the time, 26% of the time, and when you had juries as large as 12, they hung 43% of the time. So we find that with close cases, indeed, there's a much higher probability of hanging when you have a larger jury than when you have a smaller jury. Now, that's important for the following reason. Of course, a defendant would prefer to have an acquittal, and that's the most favorable outcome for a defendant. But the next best outcome is one where the jury doesn't reach any verdict at all. That is, a hung jury is a positive outcome, relatively, for the defense. And since the whole system is supposed to be rigged so that you give defendants every benefit of the doubt, that you have to have a strong, reasonable doubt in order to find somebody. The person has to be guilty beyond any reasonable doubt in order to be found guilty. This idea that by changing the size of the jury, we are actually reducing the number of hung juries means that we're actually putting defendants at a disadvantage when we use a smaller jury. And that's exactly contrary to the reasoning used by the Supreme Court. They said defendants are not going to be any worse or better off if we use smaller juries, whereas this research suggests that in fact defendants are worse off if we use smaller juries than if we use larger juries, and that's because there are going to be fewer and fewer hung verdicts, and that's a generally positive outcome for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they simply drop charges altogether when the jury can't reach a verdict. Or they might plea bargain with the defendant and say they'll charge him with a much less serious charge than they did in the first case. And it's always possible you go back and have a new trial after a hung jury and you get a full acquittal. So there are lots of positive outcomes for the defendant that can follow a hung jury, and by making those hung juries less likely, you actually are disadvantaging defendants. Now, on decision rule, you can make the argument that rules do make a difference, that is, whether they have to agree unanimously or not. So, for example, in Johnson versus Louisiana, which was that original case that the Supreme Court heard, there was a 9-3 vote for conviction. And in the state of Louisiana, they said all you needed was a 2/3 majority for this case, and that meant that since there was 9 out of 12 was more than 2/3, that they would find guilty. And if it was a different kind of case in Louisiana, then you would use a different size and a different rule, a 6-person jury that had to reach unanimously. But if you take those 12 people who were on Johnson's original verdict and you composed all the possible 6-person juries, there would be at least one of those 3 not guilty voters in 90% of all possible 6-person juries. So it's very simple to show that it makes a big difference whether you have a unanimous or non-unanimous rule being applied by the jury. In fact, in Johnson's case, if they'd used a unanimous 6-person situation instead of a 2/3 majority 12-person jury, they were much more likely to end up at least with a hung verdict and not a conviction, which is what happened not in the 12-person jury that considered Johnson's case originally. So let me make as my final point here today this question about whether not requiring unanimity squelches dissent. Does it lead to people not being able to state their position? The Supreme Court said, no, it's such an important decision that the majority will listen to the minority even though they don't have to. Even though they have enough votes to go ahead and reach a verdict, they're going to keep deliberating and keep discussing this until they've heard all the possible arguments about whether the defendant really is or isn't guilty. So in a study that we did, I was one of the people working with Jim Davis on this 1974 study. We looked at 26 juries that started their deliberation with a sufficient majority under a non-unanimous rule. That is, they had a large enough majority to reach a decision at the very first ballot. Now the question was, did they then keep deliberating, or did they simply outvote the unconvinced minority? And the answer was that of those 26 juries that had that initial sufficient majority, half of them took only one poll. That is, they took their first poll, saw that they had the majority, and then they quit and went ahead. And the remaining 13 juries only